So, okay, so that's the situation in South Africa. And I guess I'm wondering, because I think one of the things that's also happening now that is really important about these movements, particularly if we talk about them globally, is that this sort of, there was a wave that I guess you could argue started with Syriza and going through Bernie that has kind of ended, where there was this sense that maybe a genuine, let's just say, social democratic agenda had an electoral track, and it's been, destroyed in Greece, repelled in the UK, and in the United States, in coalition in Spain. So I guess there is that. Do you think that there's a potential, even though it's, the ANC is very hegemonic and there's a lot of difficulty ahead, is there the potential for a new wave in African countries from an electoral perspective as people sort of burn out on, formation, like legacy formations like the ANC, one of the most important movements in history, but now is governed for decades?
So firstly, let me give you the South African example, and then I'll say quickly about 2 or 3 other examples. I think in South Africa, the moment that presented itself as something that could be different was the what happened on campuses in South Africa between 2015 and 2017. There was this massive national student movement. Used hashtags "Rhodes Must Fall," which was a reference to a colonial figure statue, and he was a stand-in for kind of this sort of symbolic presence. It's like when people are now throwing statues into the harbor. Or I think today they took down a statue in DC, and I think there's one also in Georgia that's going to go down. So that was the one part of it, very symbolic, struggle about representation. Linked to it was another struggle called Fees Must Fall, which had to do with free public higher education. And then that movement was sort of allied with the trade union movement, but not nationally, just on campuses around the conditions of the workers who provide services in dorms, in cafeterias, and this was called the outsourcing movement, because the universities were outsourcing the work because they didn't want to deal with unions. They wanted to deal with labor brokers. So that movement, and crucially, actually, this is important about this movement, they questioned like the consensus around the ANC's right to govern, or that the Black South Africans, which is the majority of the people, had voted for the ANC and had somehow felt, the ANC wasn't delivering to them, but nobody had done anything about it. And so the students explicitly questioned like the wisdom of the 1994 political deal. So here was something that was saying, what would politics look like after nationalism? Like, so that what you call the legacy formation. So they brought us to power. Now what comes next? What's fascinating about that movement was for various reasons, and everybody has their theories, but after 2017, they just sort of fell apart. They kind of, internal contradictions, politics of purity, like
Right.
Identity politics. Also, it's a generational thing. People graduate. And so I would have, which is kind of why I sort of always talk about what I think is interesting about this BLM moment. It will be interesting to say, where does this popular energy that's in the street, like, where does it go? What will it go back into its silos? Will it degenerate into identity, what we might call identity politics? Or could this be like something that could build bigger? So that's I think what happened in South Africa. And linked to that, I think, was the inability of like the historically the movements that we associate with the left in South Africa. I think they just didn't know what to do with the students, because they were kind of uncomfortable with identity politics, even though it was necessary at the time. I think they just couldn't make sense of it, rather than sort of like, oh, this is a moment, it presents political possibilities. They wanted to go back to like, what the theory says. Or I think some of their methods was just not, or they had become NGOs, or they had become sort of wedded to the ANC. So it didn't come off. There are other movements I think that are interesting. For example, there's in Tanzania, in Uganda. And again, these depends on like the nature of the regime. So a very right, a regime that is a proxy or a junior partner of the US's war on terror, run by this guy called Yoweri Museveni, who's been in power since the 80s. We started out like as an African Marxist. with a very radical program, but he's still in power. I think it's like 30 odd years later. State corruption, patronage networks. Well, you can see the same thing with Trump, but like there it's way more pronounced, and it's very difficult for people to break the stranglehold. Police brutality, authoritarianism, one-party state, and so there's like at the level of like sort of popular culture, there was this musician. His name is Bobby Wine, like a reggae musician. And it's not clear yet where his program might go, but making music videos, he educates people with like a sort of presenting a range of ideas around public goods, around people's right to healthcare, people's right to political rights, and he's trying to run for president in the next election. So this guy Museveni has won every election since what they call democratization in the early 90s. And he has a way. He controls the electoral commission. The army runs stuff. So it will be interesting to see what happens with this moment there. I think the one other quick example is what we've seen in Nigeria, where there you have sort of like a pact between different elites. Like you govern this term, and then we have an election, and then the other set of elites govern. And of course, there's like rents and stuff involved. And so there's a lot. There's actually in Nigeria, strangely, there's a long history and a very deep history of left politics. And so there was a candidate who ran, Sowore. He ran in this last election, about 40 years old. But unfortunately, he didn't go far, partly because they arrested him. And they locked him up, I think, right after, like around the election and right after. And every time that he's about to get out of prison, they lock him up again. But so it's kind of depressing. I think the moment is very depressing. But and this is my quick last point on this. When Occupy first emerged, right? Occupy happened here in New York. I was around for that, and then it was like quiet. Then later on, Bernie Sanders came. Jacobin came. Whatever. Like at the level of popular culture, organized PSA is having a comeback. So it's like there's something about the kids who are involved in Fees Must Fall. At some point, they're going to move into the state. They're going to become civil servants. They're going to move in the NGOs. They're going to work for the social movement. So we don't know where that's, that for me, that's the hope that I'm having, that a couple of years are going to pass. They're out of school. They're settling out of university, college, and they settle into the professions. They settle into the movements, and then hopefully something interesting can come out of that.
I just want to say real quick, shouts to Milton Alamati from Black Star News, who I've done a lot of work with and who is extremely committed on Uganda. I just want to recognize him in this conversation because we discussed Uganda.